Hello. I'm going to quote the official statement that the Queen made, at least a large segment of it, in recent days, just prior to the Trooping of the Colour. Today is traditionally a day of celebration. This year, however, it is difficult to escape a very sombre national mood. Put to the test, the United Kingdom has been resolute in the face of adversity. So go use that as a context for what I want to discuss in this video. Incidentally, the Trooping of the Colour is the ceremony traditionally for the Queen's official birthday. Her actual birthday is in April, but she has an official birthday, which is a public holiday in June. Um, what she was referring to in terms of the sombre national mood was, of course, this awful disaster at Grenfell Tower, but also the three major terrorist incidents that we've had this year, and I would suspect the great deal of political uncertainty that is out there. And it is difficult to escape the sense that there has been a sort of dark cloud hanging over this country this year, specifically. Um, there is a palpable sense that we are a very divided country, that we don't really know what future direction we are taking. And all these negative news stories on top of that add to a sense of sort of a somber environment. Now, there's a lot of ways to look at this, and there's a number of things I want to encompass, so bear with me. Um, Firstly, regarding the disaster at Grenfell Tower, this is one of the worst disasters I think this country has ever seen. I think will transpire to be in three figures. Um, we know about disasters like the Aberfan tragedy in 1966, Hillsborough in 1989, Lockerbie in 1988. Um, we've had many large-scale incidents, Herald of Free Enterprise sinking in 1987. And I think this is going to be right up there with those disasters. There's many others, of course. The Harrow train crash, indeed, in 1952, which was just before the Queen's coronation. In fact, an interesting point about the coronation year, and this is probably worth mentioning. In 1953, the country was trying to look forward from the post-war austerity. Many people were still recovering from that. Many people were still, if not homeless, fundably housed. 1953, there was starting to be some good news trickle through. We heard about the ascent of Everest by Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay. The Jubilee itself was a celebration. The Festival of Britain, I believe, in 1951 was shortly before that. But then 1953 was also tempered by the Great Storm. Um, the documentary series, I think it was called Equinox, not Panorama, Equinox, Time Watch, excuse me, made a very good documentary on the Great Storm of 1953, caused utter devastation in the Netherlands and in Britain. And a lot of small communities in East Anglia were totally devastated. It also included the Victoria disaster. Earlier in the year, when I was visiting my parents in Scotland, we actually came across a small churchyard, and that contained the graves of some of those who died in the Victoria disaster, including the very brave wireless operator David Broadfoot, who was subsequently, I believe, awarded the George Cross posthumously. Anyway, the point I'm making there is that that is another year that wasn't quite the same, obviously, because that was a case of bad news being kind of shut out by the good news, by the more positive news. This year, it's a sense that a lot of the news is negative, and there were people questioning the tripping of the colour. I saw on the video for that, especially from Republicans and, to be honest, a lot of Corbyn supporters. Oh, this is so inappropriate. There's just been this disaster, and the Queen's having a celebration. Um, I don't entirely agree with that sentiment, and this is why. Firstly, I think it would be wrong if the Queen hadn't made any sort of public statement. I think if she just went and had a celebration, that would seem woefully out of touch and it would be wrong. I think what Queen Elizabeth II has always shown is a sense of stability and consistency. You know, whether you're a Republican or a Royalist, I don't think anyone could dispute that. There has been a certain ceremony, and I would say the same about the state opening of Parliament, are quirky traditions, like the Speaker being dragged to his chair. These are things that we can laugh at, and people might say they need reform and we need to get rid of them and so on. I don't think I can agree with that, and the reason being is because they are a reminder, they are an embodiment of a continuity in this country. I do believe that reforms need to be made in a lot of areas, but I think that we need to keep certain traditions because any society that gets rid of all its traditions is losing its identity. This is obvious to me. So I don't agree with those Republicans who are saying it's totally inappropriate. The Queen did actually visit the site of the disaster, and she did make public statements of condolences, and she should have. And she's done that also with the terrorist incidents with Manchester. Um, I'm not saying that she shouldn't. She should, but that's she has, just for the record. Um, when it comes to royalty, and I was tempted to make another video about this, but I guess I'll just encompass it here. I consider myself somewhat a moderate royalist. Now, what I mean by that is that I cannot see this country not being a monarchy. Now, that, of course, in itself is not a reason not to believe, to be against republicanism. But I also believe that monarchy provides a certain sense of reassurance, stability, and identity in the United Kingdom. It's very, very difficult to see a Republic of Britain with a president, Boris Johnson, for example. And again, that's not a reason not to do it, but you can't sort of throw over 1,000 years of an institution without really, really, really thinking it through. And for me, that would be a profound issue, a deeply profound issue, especially in constitutional issues like the status of Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales, which is already complex enough, thanks, in my opinion, to the moves of the nationalists. Um, what I want to address here in wider terms is so yeah, in terms of monarchy, I am broadly in favour of the monarchy continuing. However, I would say to hardcore royalists, what I don't like to see is people coming on the videos and saying, "Oh, if you don't, grovel to the Queen, then get out of the country." Britain is not Thailand, and I will always, always, always defend the right for Republicans to voice dissent. Some Republicans are overly vitriolic, and some of their criticism of the royal family is very unfair. I mean, for a woman of 91, the Queen does not sit on her behind, to put it crudely. She engages in many public engagements, and so does her family. I do get a bit annoyed when I hear people say, "Oh, William's lazy," or "Harry's lazy," or "they don't do this, they don't do that." Those guys have been absolutely dedicated in their public role, and I think they are exemplary role models for a modern royal family. I know some will say that's an archaic term and a contradiction, but what I would say to those vitriolic Republicans is I can understand you being against the principle of monarchy, i.e., its inherited power in that sense, but what I don't really like is vitriolic attacks, and sometimes it really is hateful and just downright vitriolic. On the other hand, there are certain royalists who get overly sycophantic and overly when they say things like Republicans shouldn't even be allowed a view. I consider freedom of expression far more important to our values than the royal family. And there are certain things I would not mind seeing the end of. I don't think, for example, when someone becomes a British citizen, they should first and foremost sign an oath of allegiance to the Queen. Surely their oath of allegiance should be to the country, and that they will be good citizens and obey the laws and so on, not an oath of allegiance to an individual. There's something slightly I don't like about that. Our national anthem, I would propose changing. God Save the Queen. As a tune, it's okay, but again, it comes down to sort of focus on an individual. Um, the Queen is head of state, but Americans don't have their national anthem around the president. So, and nor does any other country except other monarchies. But personally, I think if we are going to be a modern monarchy, we have to really look at this. And it would be a huge thing, but I would propose a change in the national anthem from, say, God Save the Queen to Land of Hope and Glory. It's a very patriotic piece. It's a beautiful piece of music. Um, and what I would say to royalists is none of this is unpatriotic. No, it's not even anti-royal necessarily. It's just a case of understanding that if the royal family is to survive into the 21st century, there will be some things that need to adapt. Now, I hadn't intended to make this all about royalism versus republicanism. So I'm going to get back to the other issues here. But I did want to encompass that because it came into the issue of the tripping of the colour. Broken Britain. That is something we sometimes hear. It is impossible to escape the cynicism that is out there, especially when we have a very indecisive general election result. I find myself in a strange situation because I did not want a Tory majority. There's many things I deeply dislike about the Conservative Party and their policies, but at the same time, I'm not necessarily taking a great deal of joy from this current situation, which is that no party has overall control. I mean, Labour is acting like they've won. I would, if I were Jeremy Corbyn, I'd show a little bit of humble pie. I mean, Labour is acting like they're going to launch a coup, to take over the government and install their own government. That's frankly would be illegitimate. They did not win the election. And it's not that the Tories particularly won, but they did get more seats. So the left is making this huge issue of a potential deal with the DUP. Well, I'm not a huge fan of the DUP, but I don't particularly want to see a Labour, SNP, Green, Liberal Democrat coalition either. I think that would be messy. Um, and it would also give more influence to parties whose sole goal is to break up this country. So, I certainly don't want to see that happening. And I don't think it would be legitimate. Some would say, oh, there's a progressive alliance that is far bigger than the Conservatives, which is probably true in terms of the numbers, but there's still fundamental disagreements. I mean, Labour and the Liberal Democrats are unionist parties. The SNP is not, for example. Um, so there's a lot of things to look at. In terms of bringing a broken society, broken Britain, this is something that goes back. Actually, it was David Cameron first used the term. Um, I think politicians have to be very careful with this. I think it is an inflammatory thing to say. And politicians, frankly, do play a bit of political football when it looks like their opponents are weakened. Politics is a blood sport and they will take advantage of bad situations. Now, I mentioned that I think Jeremy Corbyn has a right to speak out about the concerns around North Kensington. However, I do think Labour is also needs to temper that by not fueling anger. They have to behave like responsible politicians, not like they're basically rabble rousing. And I don't mean that as insulting to anyone who may have lost loved ones, but stirring up public anger. It's important that you understand public anger and that you voice the views of the people, but not deliberately stir things up. And I am starting to see Labour doing that to some extent. Um, but when we talk about broken Britain, what that implies is the situation is a complete and utter mess. Now, to be honest, you could probably hear similar sentiments in every multi party democracy. I mean, I've just been watching a documentary on Watergate and Nixon's resignation. Um, the Days That Shook the World documentary. In fact, I've got it right here. Yeah, interesting documentary. It also features the Kennedy assassination. Now, America is generally seen as the most powerful country in the world. The United States has had moments when there must have been great cynicism and great disillusionment. Certainly in recent years, with the racial tensions and the bitter divisiveness over this recent election. Yet, the general consensus is America is still the most powerful country in the world. The truth of the matter is, in every great power, and by great power, what am I talking about? I'm talking about states that influence, that have a particular political influence on the world stage. So G20 members, members of the Permanent UN Security Council, nuclear powers. In all these terms, the United Kingdom absolutely is a great power. We're not a superpower. We're nowhere near the sort of power that we had at the peak of the British Empire, obviously. But anyone who says that Britain is a small, insignificant country is utterly deluded, and they don't know how power works. There is a reason why Forbes magazine regularly places the British Prime Minister, regardless of who they are, in the top 20 most powerful people in the world, and more often than not in the top 10. Now, Theresa May is, I believe, when she was ranked, she was around 13th, which was a bit lower than David Cameron. But the point is, in global power dynamics, the United Kingdom is still seen as a major power. We are a major economy. We're a NATO power. We're in the UN permanent UN Security Council. All these factors must be considered. Now, I understand that power isn't necessarily the same as progress, because you can have a situation, for instance, I mean, Pakistan is a nuclear power, and yet it's arguably a failed state, with the greatest respect to any Pakistani viewers. So power dynamics is a very interesting science, but there is other things to consider. Human development. I would be a complete fool to try and argue that there is no divisions in this country. There are very deep divisions between wealth and poverty, between the sort of society that we are living in, and frankly, it's hard to ignore that a lot of this has been exposed from the recent disaster in North Kensington. So I think it would be wrong to suggest that we do not have problems. But again, this country has been tested in very profound ways before, so the Queen was right about this. We were tested in 1940 when we essentially stood alone, something I would remind my American friends when they like to boast about saving our European ass. It's something that really annoys me, actually. For 1940 and a good part of 1941, the United Kingdom stood alone as a major power. Of course, there were brave resistance movements operating all over Europe, but as a country, as a major power, we stood alone. And I think there are people out there who want this country to fail simply so they can vindicate their politics. I think that's utterly disgraceful. It's one thing pointing out the facts that there is problems in society, but there are people, I believe, who want it's, and I would extend this to foreign policy. I believe, for example, there's certain people on the left, and I'm not talking about everyone, but there are certain people on the left, for example, who want our overseas military interventions to fail in order to vindicate them. This was the case with Afghanistan. I got the impression sometimes that some of the anti war crowd simply wanted to be proven right. So they didn't care if the Taliban took over and enslaved women and blew up civilians, because that showed to them that, oh, the situation's out of hand, so we're right. What I would say is, if you genuinely believe in democracy, in progress, and human rights, you need to be consistent on these things, which means that if your emphasis is on those things, your number one issue shouldn't be, I hope, the prime minister fails. It should be, I hope this policy is right for the country or right for foreign policy. And if you disagree with it, that's totally legitimate. But again, I don't understand people who take pleasure from watching failure that affects the rest of us. I'm not talking about the small political things, but put it this way, I don't want Theresa May to be weak. That might sound strange because I'm not a conservative supporter. I don't want her to be weak because what we need right now is strong leadership. I'm not going to say strong and stable because that's probably the most overused statement in this election. To be fair, though, it's not a new statement. Gordon Brown used it. David Cameron used it. It's not something that Theresa May invented. Um, what I do want to see is some stability return to this country. So Labour pushing for another election, I'm not sure that's the right approach. Yes, it's true the Conservatives didn't get an overall majority, but Labour did not win. And that's something they also need to acknowledge. And they're acting like they did win, or they're acting like it was very close. It wasn't very close, actually. The Conservatives got 318 votes, I believe. Excuse me, 318 seats to Labour's 262. Now, the Conservatives didn't get a majority, but they were well ahead of Labour. Labour had a good night, but they did not win. So I think we need to be very cautious. I'm not convinced that another election is the right answer to this. For one thing, I mean, from a purely human perspective, MPs that have fought hard to either gain their seats or retain their seats are going to be exhausted. Let them get on with their jobs. Constantly, this country has had two general elections, two bitterly divisive referendums, um, council elections, and London mayoral elections. All of this has been in the space of 3 years. I really do think now is the time to let the dust settle just a little bit. Let's have at least 1 year with no national election or referendum. I'm a Democrat. I believe in giving people a voice, but there is such a thing as actually overwhelming people. Like that woman in Bristol said, not another one. And I am starting to get that sense. We need to let the dust settle just a little bit. Let the Prime Minister get on with her job. I mean, that's not to say don't criticise her. Don't, I'm not saying don't express dissent, but instability will help no one. Instability isn't going to help the most vulnerable people in this country. I think the best thing would be an effective opposition that will hold the government to account. So, from the Labour side, I would say Jeremy Corbyn has done better than expected. Now's the time for Labour people to stop attacking the leader. That would give a strong opposition. And for the Tory side, again, I don't see. I get that George Osborne was fired by May, but calling her a dead woman walking probably isn't the best way to bring about stability in this country. It is hyperbole and it doesn't help anyone, even if it's true. So those are just a few of my thoughts. I mean, people can point out and say things like, "Oh, Nathan, what about this? What about that? What about the other?" What I would say is, for all the problems we have, there are some positive things that have to be acknowledged. Look at the election we've had. We do not see politicians getting paramilitaries to kill each other. We do not see, one defeated side. Well, that hasn't been the case here, but we don't see that in our politics, that the defeated side then mounts a military coup against the winning side. We do not see, um, generally, election violence. We do not see massive scale fraud. These are all things that we need to acknowledge. Look around the world. So, by comparison to many countries, the UK is actually politically stable. But there are voices out there that, frankly, don't want this. They want constant question marks. They want constant around the issue of stability. They want to constantly push for breaking up this country. Now, I'm not going to make too fine a point on this because I've talked about it at length, but the SNP will have to realise now that their constant push for a second referendum cost them votes. So if I were Nicola Sturgeon, I'd stick to the day job and focus on other issues, health, education, and so forth. The Scottish people clearly don't want another referendum, neither does most other people in this country. What we really, really need now is a period of stability. And in terms of free terrorist attacks in this big disaster, certainly a lot of things have come at once, but I think it's just been an unfortunate time. I don't think this necessarily, I don't know about the terrorism issue, that could be a problem, but it has actually been a long time since this country has experienced a disaster on the scale of Grenfell Tower. So I don't think we should suddenly think this is going to be the new norm. I think this was a horrible accident. Certainly there's going to have to be things that are reviewed, but I'll just close with this. If you care about this country at all, if you have any sense of patriotism, whether you're right wing or left wing, you will want this country to succeed, whoever is in government, in terms of the country. So cynicism is real, but we can also do our part by not fueling cynicism, by not only focusing on the negative, by not constantly wanting people to feel to prove a point. Yes, we have to speak out where there is injustice. Yes, we have to speak out at the deep social problems that do exist in our society. But for goodness sake, let's get together. I mean, yesterday there was another event, the Get Together Day, arranged by the widower of Joe Cox. I think that was a good event because I don't think it was overly political. It wasn't, obviously they're left wing people, but it was done in the spirit of speaking to people who may come from a different political background. And I give Brendan Cox credit for that, and and the rest of the family. I believe that was a very worthwhile initiative. It's not about being politically correct. We do have to be honest about issues like Islamism, but we have to also learn to be a little bit less tribal and not dislike people simply because they are from a different political viewpoint. And I include myself in that. It's not easy, and we will always have politically robust debates. But let's just hope the best for this country, by which I mean the United Kingdom. This is a great country. And I don't accept that it isn't. But being a great country doesn't mean that it's a perfect country, and it doesn't mean that there is not serious problems. You could point to other parts of the world and say this country does this thing better, and that will be true. But I do not understand people who live in a country that they are so cynical about. And I would suggest, if you can, if you're not contributing to society, if all you want to do is complain, you're not helping anyone. So we'll leave it there. Do we have a broken Britain? I wouldn't go that far. Do we have a society that has serious problems? Yes. And let's all play a role in trying to bring this country forward. Thank you for watching.